My name is Malte Frøslee Ibsen. I am a researcher and teacher in political theory, and I have a PhD in political theory from Frankfurt and studied at Oxford prior to this. Worked for some years in universities teaching and doing research and a bit for think tanks as well in Denmark recently. I guess that's it.
Could you tell me about a time when you changed your mind about a very long-standing belief?
This is really difficult. I was just thinking about this before we connected. I think something that's always difficult about this is that sometimes you change your mind without really noticing it. So it has to be one time, I guess, where I reflected upon changing my mind about something that was important to me. The only thing I can think of is a really kind of philosophical issue. So one issue is that I used to think that there is something special about human beings relative to nature and other animals in a way that I don't think I do anymore. I used to think that human beings have moral value, partly or wholly as a consequence of their agency, their ability to make decisions about right and wrong, and that this sort of fundamentally distinguishes human beings from the other animals and nature, or non-human nature, and that the distinction also implies that only human beings have moral value and animals and nature don't. And I think that's a belief that I've sort of given up on. I've come to think of it in much more scalar terms, so not binary. So it's more of a kind of human beings are at one point in the scale, and then you have sort of the other animals quite nearby, actually, I would say, in some ways. And then you have nature. I guess some of it is like it's about a change in a larger set of beliefs that has to do with this kind of sharp distinction between human beings and nature, or society and nature, as being less stark, I guess, or less kind of well-defined than I used to think. And then that also has sort of moral implications somehow.
Do you think you have any beliefs that will never change or that you will never abandon?
Yes, I do think I have beliefs that will never change. So I think the starting point, so if we think about that, like the change in belief, which is kind of about softening the boundary, I guess, between human beings and other animals in nature, also in moral terms. But I don't think so the belief that every human being has kind of innate moral worth, I don't think that will never change. That's sort of I guess there are sort of like bedrock beliefs, and that will never change, I think. I think of it more as it's a case of an extension of a belief in a sense, but place from which it's an extension of the idea that human beings have moral value, then extended to other animals and maybe parts of nature as well. But the kind of bedrock belief there is human beings have this innate moral value, and that's never going to change, I think. So that's one example of a value. But that's a very kind of foundational value. I guess there are other beliefs that I seriously doubt would change. But on the other hand, who knows, like when I get old and really kind of angry and grumpy, and I might start believing something very different from what I do now. But I'm fairly certain about that one belief.
Now onto a different topic. What does it mean to disagree well?
I think disagreeing well is something that you can think of it in various ways. But one way to think of it is that if disagreeing well is too easy, so if people are not actually that much in disagreement, then in some sense it's not really disagreement. It's kind of more superficial disagreement. I think a really sort of praiseworthy, or what would you call it, like admirable kind of disagreement is when people really disagree about something and still are able to respect one another's positions, and also ideally engage with each other in a way that leaves the other person with an understanding of the basis of the disagreement, so that it's not just kind of this standoff of mutually uncomprehending parties, but that that the disagreement leaves both parties to the disagreement better off, in the sense that both understand why they disagree, and that they can, at some level, sort of respect the grounds of the disagreement. And of course, that's not always possible. Sometimes you disagree with people at such a fundamental level that you can't really find it in yourself to respect the basis of the disagreement. But disagreeing well, I think, is something, there's a kind of sweet spot there where it has to be real disagreement if it makes sense to speak about it. But it also has to be the kind of disagreement where you can make sense of it from your own, both parties can make sense of it from their respective points of view, and sort of respect each other's position and learn from each other, ideally.
And so do you have any ideas about, let's say, what schools or universities can do to promote this kind of good and reasonable disagreement?
I think they have to, following from those thoughts, I think what schools and universities can and should do is to expose students both to real disagreements, so really sort of conflicting issues, values, also polarizing issues. So some of the issues that polarize sort of political debates in the external world. So real disagreement, but also sort of respectful engagement with one another. And of course, this is something that's, so anything that people disagree about at a quite basic level can of course be uncomfortable. So I don't think it's a matter of sort of, it's not a matter of like throwing all sorts of horrible things and issues. And like, it's not a question of sort of exposure to nastiness for the sake of exposure or something like that. But it's taking the disagreements that we find in sort of actual political debate, taking them seriously and bringing them into the classroom at some level, and not confining debates, let's say political education, to issues that are more sort of congenial. And because I mean, that's also, I think that's something that is important for students to be prepared for, is that in many ways, like political debate in many of our societies is becoming more kind of difficult, intractable, polarized. And I think some of the issues that are being debated and discussed quite aggressively, I think it's important to kind of bring them into the classroom. But it's also super important, I think, to, while bringing those debates into the classroom, then also introducing norms of deliberative disagreement that I was talking about before, so that we disagree, but we would respect one another, and we can disagree in a kind of an amiable way and not kind of amicable. I think that's the challenge, is that a lot of political debate, especially online, is sort of quite nasty. But I think it's important to still sort of, for schools and universities to maintain that focus on deliberative norms and trying to make sense of your other discussion partners or the other's point of view, so to speak, in a respectful way, even while being able to confront really difficult issues. So I think both of those aspects are important, that it shouldn't be this sort of kind of superficial level of political debate, or it shouldn't be sort of like all the easiest political debates. It should also be the really difficult ones, but it should be paired always with a kind of training or being accustomed to these norms of deliberative disagreement.